At-risk has a number of built-in functions called property functions. You can see a list of these in the Insert Function drop-down list. All of these. There is no common theme to these various functions, so it is somewhat difficult to describe them as a group. You will typically see them when you add input distributions or when you add at-risk outputs. They are essentially tacked on to the input distribution functions or the risk output function, and they are typically used to describe the inputs or outputs in some way. As a simple example, suppose you select an output cell and click the Add Output button. This suggests a name for the output, but you can override it to say revenue. Then you will see that the function risk output of revenue has been added to the formula. However, there is another way you can do this. From the Add Output dialog box, if you click the FX button, you see this dialog. If you fill it in as shown, revenue, dollars, and I'll specify continuous, you see how risk output has been changed. The first three arguments of risk output are reserved for the name, the range name, and the position in the range, respectively. These latter two arguments aren't used here, hence the extra 2 commas. But the final two arguments you see are the property functions, risk units, and risk is discrete. In this case, their values will be reflected in at-risk output graphs and reports. Another use of property functions for an at-risk output is in a Six Sigma quality control setting. Suppose the output must be between lower and upper specification limits, LSL and USL, of 172 and 228, and it should have a target of 202. Then when you add the output, and click the FX button, you can give it a name and units, and you can click the Six Sigma tab and fill out the resulting dialog box as shown. Click OK, click OK, and you can see that now there is another property function, the risk Six Sigma function, with the arguments that I specified. There is also the units, risk units property function. Now I will run a simulation for that output. As you can see, the histogram of the output shows the specification limits, the target, the name, and the units. Property functions can also be added to input distribution functions, again to describe or modify them in some way. The easiest way to do this is by clicking the FX button to the right of the cell formula box in the Define Distributions window. There's the normal distribution. I will click the FX button to open this dialog box. I'll fill it out as shown. With these settings, the distribution formula changes as you see here. Now there are 3 property functions, risk name, risk units, and risk static. The name and units will appear in at-risk graphs and reports. The static value is the value you will see when the at-risk dice button is toggled to static. 99. Another important property function that can be used with input distributions is the risk-cormat function. This allows you to induce correlations between various inputs. The easiest way to do this is through the Define Correlations button on the at-risk ribbon. Because this is such an important topic, it is discussed in more detail in the Correlated Inputs video in the Guided Tour series. You shouldn't feel obligated to memorize or even learn all of the available property functions in at-risk. Some are quite specialized, and you might never need to use them. However, you should at least be aware of property functions, and you should not be surprised when you see them tacked on to familiar input distribution functions and risk output functions.